Before I joined the Park Service, I used to work as a trail guide for a company based out of Groveland near eastern Yosemite. It was awesome work, and for the most part, all the memories I have of it are happy ones. But there's one job I remember for all the wrong reasons. I was guiding a group of young corporate types up Half Dome in one of those team bonding exercises. A lot of jobs were kind of like that, especially around the holidays. We'd take them up to Little Yosemite Valley, and then set them up for a night around the campfire, and then take them up Half Dome the next morning. This bunch, 4 men and 3 women, seemed pretty average. Some were a little more comfortable than others being outdoors, but they didn't strike me as trouble. But the next day, as we were taking a break coming back down Half Dome, we heard a scream. While the rest of us rested our legs and got some water, 2 of the men had gone off to take pictures of the view overlooking the valley. Maybe a minute or 2 later, we heard a god-awful yell coming through the trees. Then one of the men came running back looking scared to death. He said his buddy was taking a picture near the edge of a cliff when he'd suddenly slipped and fell. I had an idea of how bad it was just from his expression, but when I got there, I saw it was way worse. The guy was lying at the bottom of a steep slope. Not quite a sheer fall-off type of cliff, but all the tumbling he'd done on the way down had left him in a really bad way. He'd fallen maybe 200 feet down this slope. He wasn't moving, and he wasn't making any noise. I asked the group that I was guiding to keep away from that slope and to gather where we'd just been resting until I got back. I needed to run down the trail to find a gentler portion of the slope to scramble down so I could administer first aid to that wounded man, and I needed them all safe and in one place so I could find them afterwards. Everyone agreed except for the taller guy who'd seen the fall, as he insisted on helping in some way. He looked to be in decent shape and able to keep up, so we took off down the trail at jogging pace as I radioed for help from HQ. I remember as we were running, the tall guy kept asking me about the dude that had fallen, saying stuff like, "Do you think he's dead?" And I told him I had no idea. Some people survive some crazy falls, not always in one piece, but they still survive. And this seemed to reassure him a little, but not by much. As we kept running, I relayed a more detailed description of our location to HQ. My boss had been in touch with the park rangers who were sending out ATVs in a life flight. I tried to describe where we were as best I could, but after that it became a case of trying to get the ATV's attention when they arrived in the area so they didn't roll past us and waste valuable minutes. The taller guy and I kept on running until we found a gentler slope we could get down, and then we made our way down to the bottom, careful not to trip and make our own selves casualties. At the bottom, we ran around back to where the guy had fallen, and when we got there, we were greeted by what was probably the worst thing I'd ever seen on the job. That fallen man had multiple fractures, severe abrasions to his face and head, and he was completely unconscious. But after a quick check of his pulse, I found that he was actually still alive. I radioed HQ again and told my boss that somehow our guy was still around, and that was the good news. But the bad news was that the state of his injuries meant that he was probably quickly running out of time. My boss said that he'd pass that on to the rangers, and then after giving that injured man what little first aid we could, what came next was essentially just a waiting game. We had to stay put and hope either the ATVs or that life flight spotted us in time. It was tense, very tense, and the taller guy kept asking, "Is he dead? Can he hear us?" and all that kind of stuff. He kept trying to talk to this guy, saying, "You're gonna be okay, man. Just hang in there." I didn't think the injured man could hear him, but I wasn't about to interrupt him when he was essentially trying to make himself feel better. But then after, he started saying stuff like, "He just tripped, man. There was nothing that I could have done. One second I was looking through my camera, and the next he was just tumbling down that slope." I tried my best to reassure him that accidents happen in the wilderness, and he kind of echoed that same point in the next thing he said, but there was something about the way he said it that just didn't sound right to me. And the thing he said was, "It wasn't my fault." I know that makes sense for him to say something like that, and hearing it read out loud like that, it's probably not going to raise any red flags for you. But at the time, it sounded like he wasn't trying to reassure his buddy anymore. He was trying to reassure himself. I've seen some pretty bad accidents and injuries during my time, everything from animal attacks to accidental shootings, and every single time I'm amazed by how selfless folks can be. They'll rip up their own shirts and use them as tourniquets or offer to carry the injured person for miles and miles without a break. What they want, what's good for their well-being, that isn't important anymore. Priorities have been totally rearranged, and it's all about the injured person, always. So when this guy started talking about himself, repeating how the injured man had suddenly slipped and it totally wasn't his fault, I'm thinking, this guy's a total douche. And that's legitimately all I was thinking, that the taller guy was some kind of self-centered a-hole, and I didn't devote any more brain power to it because I had obviously more important things to worry about. I was 110% focused on the horizon, eyes and ears peeled for any sign or sound of the ATVs or the helicopters, so I let the comments slide and carried on trying to do my job. The taller guy started freaking out again and asking me a whole bunch of questions. I told him to shut up and check the injured man's pulse. It was weak, but it was still there. I remember saying a silent prayer for someone to show up soon. This sort of full-body sensation of like trying to force something into being. And then after a few more minutes of feeling my hope start to dwindle, I heard the sound of ATV engines getting louder and louder as they came round that mountain. Myself and that tall man started yelling and jumping up and down waving our arms, and then that's when they saw us. The guys on the ATVs came in fast with a stretcher and some first aid. They not only had the gear to stop the injured man's bleeding, but they also had the GPS and the radios to tell that air ambulance exactly where it needed to land so they could get him on board as fast as possible. It was a terrible thing to happen, and all my sympathies were with that injured man, but those rangers were incredible to watch. They kept their heads cool while dealing with injuries so bad I could barely look at them, and then just as they were getting the injured man on their stretcher, we all heard the sound of rotor blades booming above us as that air ambulance flew into view. It was like seeing an angel coming down from heaven. Not so much the sight of it, of course, but the feeling I got when I saw that crazy brave pilot suddenly pitch and turn in the air above us. They were heroes in the truest sense of the word, putting their own bodies on the line just to save a few seconds, because a couple of seconds could be the difference between life and death. The helicopter landed not far from us, then the two rangers picked up the stretcher and then ran over to the thing as it set down but kept its blades spinning. The door swung open as the rangers got close, and then two medics hopped out to help them haul the stretcher into the belly of that chopper. And after that, they hopped back in before the rangers backed off, then after the door slammed close, they took off and disappeared behind that mountain again. The rangers ran back over to us as the sound of those rotor blades eventually faded. One of them asked where the rest of the group was. When we explained that we were further up the trail, they gave me and the tall guy a ride back up to them. Then slowly but surely, they helped us all get back down the valley floor before we made our way back to camp. Looking back on it, I feel like I should have noticed sooner, but it wasn't until everyone was back at camp that I started to notice something about the tall guy. Every other member of the group seemed devastated, like truly heartbroken that something so terrible and random could have happened to them on what was supposed to be a fun team-building exercise. But the tall guy seemed almost, how do you really even put this, distant. He didn't seem to do any kind of grieving or hurting on his own. He just walked around offering cold comfort like it was nothing but a chance to display leadership capabilities. It was strange. And he even repeated what he said about it not being his fault. And then while reassuring everyone that there was nothing he could have done to stop it, and how just witnessing the fall was traumatizing to him, it seemed like he was trying to divert a little of that sympathy onto himself. That time, instead of just thinking of what an asshole, I remember thinking, okay, now this is strange. Now don't get me wrong, I understand that seeing something like that is a terrible thing, and it has an awful effect on a person's mind. Heck, maybe it's just something that you had to be there for. But take my word on the fact that something about the way the guy was behaving just didn't pass the smell test, so to speak. It had a lot to do with something I'd heard that previous night, but I'll get to that point later on. Now anyways, I waited with the group at the valley campsite till their ride showed up, and then I made my way back to headquarters to fill my boss in on everything crazy that had happened. I went through the whole thing with him, start to finish, and then when I was done, I told him what I'd been starting to suspect over the past couple of hours. I didn't think the injured man slipped. I thought he was pushed, and I thought the taller guy was the one who did the pushing. It might sound cruel, but my boss was a veteran ex-ranger who was just about carved out of wood, and by that I mean he'd been there, done that, and gotten the t-shirt too. He laughed when I told him what I thought, and then he jokingly asked if the taller guy had tried to finish the injured man off when we got to the bottom of the slope. When I told him no, that he helped me stem the bleeding and check his pulse, he told me, doesn't seem like a stone-cold killer, does he? But he didn't laugh after I told him what I'd heard that night before, and was the same thing that I told the cop who came to visit me a few weeks later. My boss gave me the heads up that someone was about to call, and when he told me it was the cops, I felt like every dark suspicion of mine had been confirmed at once. 2 detectives stopped by to ask me a bunch of questions, and I didn't tell them outright because I knew that they had their list of questions to ask me. But when it came to the question of me noticing anything suspicious during the night before the accident, I gave them both barrels. I told them how that previous night, the tall man and injured man went off to talk in private. I told them to stay close and to come back to the fire as soon as possible, but they didn't listen. And then after some time, I decided to go look for them. I walked off the direction they'd gone, and although I couldn't see them right away, I heard them loud and clear. They were trying to keep their voices down, but they were clearly having some kind of heated debate. And I don't want to say that they were yell whispering because that sounds kind of dumb, but it clearly was loud. I got closer and closer, honing in on the sounds of their voices when I suddenly heard one of them say something along the lines of, "Oh, is that it? You want me out of the way? Well, good luck, buddy." The other guy cut back in with this reassuring tone to his voice, but I didn't catch anything he said after I called out to them both to come back to camp. And they assured me that they'd return in a minute or two, which they did, and I put their discussion down to something to do with business. It didn't occur to me that out of the way might mean physically out of the way, and not just sort of like fired or laid off. When I mentioned that thing about the out of the way argument, both the detectives stopped writing notes and they sort of gave each other this sort of look. They didn't come out and say it, but I could tell that they had their own suspicions about the accidental fall. But what they did tell me was how the injured guy was in a coma, meaning he wasn't talking to anybody anytime soon. It was a relief to hear that he'd survived, but it sucked hearing that he hadn't all the way survived, you know? But that's why they were talking to me, instead of just asking the guy if he had really slipped, or if he had been pushed. After thanking me for my time, I helped them out of the trailer and then called my boss to tell him everything that had been said. I guess it was a little I told you so moment because those guys were quite clearly about to launch some kind of attempted murder case, and although I don't know how it all panned out for them or if the injured man ever woke up from his coma, my mind's already made up. I think that not only was there an attempted murder during one of my guided hikes, but I got a front row seat to watch that psychopath try and worm his way out of it. Okay, I guess this is kind of 2 stories for the price of 1, but the first one is kind of an explainer that's also kind of upsetting, so I'll just breeze through it to get to the stuff that actually matters. And for the record, I'm a woman, and I was still a 20-year-old college student when this happened to me. I used to work as a trail guide way down south, taking folks out into nature reserves to make sure that they see all they want to see without getting themselves lost. One day I was out walking my dog down one of the trails when I heard a gunshot. My dog and I went to investigate because hunting is super not legal in that nature reserve, and that's how we found ourselves a poacher doing something despicable to an innocent animal. And I ran back to my cabin, called the rangers, and then within just a couple of hours, the guy was actually in cuffs. and it felt like an incredible achievement, knowing that we'd helped put someone who threatened the animals behind bars. But one of my fellow guides seemed a little less enthusiastic about it than the rest. I figured that she was maybe a little jealous or something like that, and now I know otherwise. Regardless, I rode that wave of good feeling for about a week or two, but after a while, everything went back to normal, and it kind of faded into the background. 6 weeks after the poaching arrest, I got a guiding job for a solo hiker. We mostly dealt with groups of people, be it families or classes of middle school kids, but requests for solo guides weren't entirely unusual. Some folks wanted to go hiking, they just didn't have anyone to go with, and that was one of our company's selling points. We'd get the odd older gentleman coming in to book a guide because he wanted to go visit a trail he'd visited during his younger years, and at the same time, those could be the easiest and the most rewarding assignments of all. The pace wasn't too hard, and seeing how happy they were when you arrived at a certain creek, valley, or waterfall, it was priceless. And that's why I didn't hesitate when I saw the single name appear on my schedule for the week. Mr. Cliff was all it read. And when I asked what reason he'd given for requesting a guide, I was told he was a gentleman in his 50s scouting locations for a photography project he was planning. I thought that sounded really cool, and when Mr. Cliff arrived on the day of the hike, he was just as nice as I expected. He was a widower with grown-up kids who picked up photography as a way of occupying himself. He lived locally, but since he wasn't as spry as he used to be and didn't know the trails, he figured it wouldn't hurt to pay for a trail guide so he could enjoy a little company during his walk. We worked out a route at the office, one that'd take around 4 hours there and back, and then we hit the trails at around 11 a.m. He said Cliff was his first name and that he'd worked as a trucker for most of his adult life until a work-related injury just put him on workers' comp. That was the reason he wasn't as mobile as he used to be, and why his kids thought it'd be safer for him to enlist the help of a trail guide. He was great company too, and asked me a bunch of questions about my life and the plans I had for it. He apologized for all the questions at one point, saying that he didn't get to talk to people much anymore, not since he retired and his kids moved out of town. I told him it was no problem at all, and I was grateful to be guiding such a friendly conversationalist. He gave me this big, warm smile, and we kept on walking. We talked about photography for a while, and he sounded really passionate about it. And then, at around an hour and 30 into the hike, just as we were reaching the destination we picked out, I started asking more questions about him. I'd asked him a couple of pretty basic things upon being introduced, but since he was a widower, I didn't want to probe too much into his family because of how upsetting it might be for him. But then, as we got into the subject of family, and after explaining my own was a mix of Irish and Puerto Rican, I asked where his family was from. And I'll never forget how he smiled as I looked back at him, and how he said, "I was hoping this might come up." Then he explained that since it was such a long story, we better wait until we got to the top of the rise that we were heading up so we could both get comfortable. I had no reason to suspect that I was in for anything but a good story and a well-deserved rest. But when we got to the top and we caught our breath, things took a nasty turn. The whole hike, Cliff had been sweet as pie, and every word he'd said had a sort of cheeriness about it. But as he started to tell me all about his family, his tone of voice slowly shifted until he barely even sounded like the same person anymore. He explained that his family had been some of the first colonists to arrive in what later became known as the Georgia colony, and that they'd lived in the area for almost 300 years. He said not all families could say that because not all of them lasted that long. But he and his had faced down the natives, the British, then the Union and the federal government, all one after the other, and they were still there to tell their story. I remember saying, "Wow, that's amazing. I understand why you guys are so proud." I had no reason to think that he'd react any other way but, well, to what was intended as a compliment. And yet somehow Cliff seemed to take issue with that. He told me, "I don't think you do understand, but you will." And then he launched back into a story about what his family had done to survive. He said when the natives tried running them out of their homes, they learned how to fight. Then when the British tried starving them out, they learned to live off the land, just like the natives had done before. When the Union took everything of value, they found other ways to make their money, and since folks were always going to need meat for their pots and furs to keep warm in the wintertime, hunting and trapping became their way of keeping food on the table when times were at their hardest. They later brewed moonshine during Prohibition, but when the price fell after Prohibition was rescinded, they didn't mind, he said, because they still had their oldest and most faithful way of winning their daily bread, by working the land that God Almighty had given them. I might have been very naive back then, but I wasn't stupid. All that mention of living off the land and the hunting, trapping, and skinning his family had done to make money, all that had me thinking of one thing, that he was going to be killing animals on the land. And when I thought of illegal hunting, I thought of that guy that I'd found 6 weeks prior, the one we'd reported and had arrested after I caught him hunting on the reserve. All that came to mind all right, but I guess I was still too young and naive to really piece together what I was hearing until it was far too late to do anything about it. Cliff pointed off into the distance, toward a hill maybe a mile or two away, and then asked if I knew the name of it. I turned and looked at it for a moment, but as much as I liked to think that I knew the land, I didn't know the hill's name, so I asked Cliff what it was called. He said it had been called many things over the years, but his family had always called it home. Everything they could see from the top of the hill that counted as home too, and although many had tried, no one had ever been able to stop living the only way that they knew how. Not the British, not the Union, and not some stuck-up Yankee college kid who thought that she ought to tell others how to live. I turned to defend myself, verbally of course, and that's when I saw the handgun Cliff was holding. And panic hit me, and my first instinct was to run, but when Cliff raised the gun at me and told me to stop, it was like he'd cast some spell on me or something. My legs just stopped, even though I wanted to keep running like hell, and when Cliff told me to kneel, it was like my knees buckled upon command. I remember sobbing, like really sobbing and saying, I'm sorry, please don't kill me, I didn't know," over and over because I'd realized who Cliff, definitely not his real name, really was. The poacher I'd reported hadn't been some lone hunter, straying out of bounds to cheat the system a little. He was part of some organized poaching racket, and Cliff was one of his partners. I remember how, in the middle of all that begging and sobbing and listening to metal sounds of the gun being loaded, I remembered my coworker's muted reaction to the poacher being arrested during the previous month. She knew what was going to happen, and that's why she couldn't be happy for me, but she was still too scared to warn me. Had she gotten a similar warning before, one that she'd kept quiet about, or had she just heard stories? I'd never find out. I quit the company the day after this whole thing happened, but up on that hill, I didn't think that I'd live to see that next day come at all. Cliff walked up behind me as I kept on begging and pleading, and then I felt him push the gun onto the back of my head before I heard a loud click. I stopped sobbing, held my breath, and I felt my whole body seize up as each one of my final thoughts seemed to be of my mom. I heard Cliff behind me say, "This is what we do to folks like you around here." But then instead of a bang when he pulled the trigger, instead of everything going black, I heard another metal click at the back of my head before Cliff took the tip of the gun off the back of my scalp. I peed myself. I'm still kind of embarrassed to say it, but it's the truth. I heard that click, and it was like a full body release. But it was only yellow, no brown. But I was so terrified of death in that moment that even when it didn't come, I still peed my pants. I think there's probably an exact medical term for what happened to me in the moments after, as I heard Cliff laughing at how scared I was. I don't want to say it was catatonia because I could still see and hear everything okay. I just couldn't move. I could breathe all right, but after curling up into a ball, I just laid there, taking shallow breaths and waiting for the end to come. I didn't quite realize what he'd done yet, as in, like, performing a mock execution on me. I thought maybe his gun had jammed or something and the shot was coming any second. But then, Cliff spoke. He told me his pa had said not to kill me, as that'd bring even more trouble down on them, whoever them was. But he was to make it very clear that if I reported any more poaching or trapping in the areas they called home, they wouldn't be playing pretend anymore. They'd be playing for real. And after that final warning, the man who said his name was Cliff left me lying there in the dirt, and I didn't get back to the office for hours and hours because I was way too shaken to drive at first. We called the cops. They searched the area and put out an APB, but no one was ever found. The cops told us they offered a reduced sentence to the guy who was caught poaching, saying they'd chop his jail time in half if he just gave them a name, but he was just stonewalling them and said that he didn't know what they were talking about. I'd like to be able to say that I went back to the trails, but unfortunately, that incident marked the end of my guiding days for good, and I moved back to Michigan once I graduated. I've got a pretty traumatic story to share from a couple of years back when I was 21 and still in college. Since we're both outdoorsy, my friend Jada and I decided to go hiking in the Cascades one weekend, and we thought it'd be fun to hit the trails and take in the views. So we meet Warren on the trail, and he's this good-looking dude probably in his early 30s and has super friendly vibes. He also said that he was a professor at Evergreen State University and knew the Cascades like the back of his hand. We chatted for a few minutes, and he offered to show us around this cool spot that he knew of. He seemed legit, clean-cut, confident, the kind of guy you'd trust, and so we both think, sure, why not? We follow him to this nearby beauty spot, and it's honestly gorgeous, like literally perfect to take some pictures. Warren's easy to talk to. He's cracking little jokes and pointing out random plants to give us facts about. And it was like he was giving us a private tour, and at first, it felt like we lucked out meeting him. After maybe an hour or two, Warren offers to walk us back to our car at the trailhead. Me and Jada figured it was about time to call it quits, so we took him up on his offer. The weather was still great, and we're still talking back and forth with Warren, so we're moving at a leisurely pace while enjoying the last trail of the day when Warren suddenly makes a suggestion. He says, "Wait a second. By my calculation, if we just hike through this section of trees here, it'll take us to the trailhead without having to loop around." Or he said something along those lines, and we trusted him, so we figured, cool, shorter walk sounds good. We started heading off the main trail in the trees, and I figured it'd only be a few minutes of walking or whatever before we started to see signs of life. But to me and Jada, it kind of looked like he was leading us deeper into the woods. It got real quiet, and Warren kept trying to keep the conversation going, but Jada in particular got very quiet too, and she's only that quiet when she's nervous. When she started lagging behind, I glanced back and saw her shake her head at me, signaling that she didn't want to continue. I knew exactly what she was talking about, so I told Warren that me and Jada weren't so sure about this shortcut and wanted to head back toward the trail. Warren turned around, and at first he just smiled. And he says, "Ah, come on. It's just a shortcut. I've been here dozens of times." His voice was still friendly, but it had this weird edge to it, like he was forcing the friendliness now. Jada shook her head and then backed up by saying she wanted to go back too, not just me. Warren kept on smiling, but his eyes narrowed over a little as he looked at us. He told us we were being silly, that there was nothing to worry about, but Jada wasn't backing down. She said she wasn't taking another step into those woods, and not a thing he could say could convince her otherwise. And that's when he started to get mean. He responds by saying, "Oh my God, what's wrong with you? I said it's fine." He tried to smile at us after, but we heard the aggression in his voice when he asked Jada what was wrong with her. And that was the mask-off moment for us. I grabbed Jada's arm, and then we turned and started quickly walking back toward the trail we'd just been on. But then seconds later, I heard it. fast and heavy footsteps crunching up behind us. Warren yelled, "Where do you think you're going?" And we sped up, almost jogging then, but he was faster. Suddenly I heard Jada let out this yelp of panic, and I felt this horrible chill go through me. I spun around just in time to see Warren's hand clamped around Jada's arm before he yanked her back so hard she stumbled. She screamed at him to let go as she tried to wrestle herself free, but Warren was too strong. The look on his face was totally different too, nothing like the charming guy we'd been laughing with just an hour before. He screamed at us, "You're not leaving!" Then the next thing, he shoves Jada to the ground so hard it sounded like it knocked the wind out of her. She sprawled in the dirt for a second and then started scrabbling for a grip as she tried to push herself to get away from Warren. I froze for a split second, my mind going 200 miles an hour thinking, what the hell's going on? Is this really happening? But it was, and I needed to do something to stop it. I remember seeing Warren just looming over Jada with his fist clenched and his chest heaving, looking like he was about to jump again. And then a thought hit me right between the eyes. I unzipped my fanny pack, fumbled past my keys and sunscreen, and then grabbed hold of a cold metal canister of pepper spray. I then yanked it out, pointed it at Warren, and then yelled at him to back off. My voice shook so badly I barely recognized it, and at first when he turned around, he just laughed his almost mocking-sounding cackle at me. He took a step towards me, staring me right in the eye, and dared me to use it. He didn't have to ask me twice. I pressed the button, unleashing a stream of pepper spray that hit him square in the face. He screeched so loud and crazily from the pain that it sounded like an animal, and then he backed off, rubbing his eyes and face. The pepper spray worked, but the breeze hit us too. Some of the spray blew back in a stinging mist that hit my eyes and nose like fire. I choked, tears were forming in my eyes, and Jada got some too as she got up and ran towards me and was pressing her hand to her eyes as she yelled at me to run. We knew that was our chance, and so we bolted through the woods even though we were both half blind. I remember branches whipping at my face and snagging at my hair, but neither of us were about to stop for anything, because behind us, we could still hear Warren screaming stuff like, "Run, bitches, I'll catch you anyway." I'm not joking. And we ran till our lungs burned and our legs were screaming, and we kept going until we finally burst out on that main trail. But I was so relieved I almost collapsed against a tree, gasping for air as my eyes still streamed from the stray pepper spray. But even then, we didn't stop to catch our breath for long. We kept on going back to the car where my hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key into the ignition. Jada was frantically looking out for Warren and later told me that she was terrified of seeing him crashing through the bushes before he attacked the car. I managed to start the car, then we got the hell out of there. My eyes were still burning from the pepper spray, but I didn't care. Getting out of there was the only thing that mattered. As soon as we hit a spot with cell service, I pulled over and Jada called 911. She spilled everything while I sat there in silence, staring out the window with eyes that were still sore from that pepper spray. I couldn't hear exactly what the dispatcher said, but she sounded calm and kept Jada on the line until the cops showed up. We gave our statements, still in shock, and then the cops said that they'd do everything they could to bring Warren in. We told them about his job at Evergreen State too, but they later called back saying that there was no such professor who was employed at that college, and that there were 2 students named Warren, but neither matched our description. In looking back, it's insane how fast our fun little hike turned into a complete and utter nightmare. I still think about it sometimes, and the thought of how we went from charming to terrifying in a heartbeat, and how close we came to something worse, it sent chills through me. I'm so glad we got out and that we're both okay, but it also taught me to trust my gut and that if something feels off, even just a little, it probably is. Be careful out there, especially hiking or in places where it's just you and some rando, and carry pepper spray if you can. You never know when it will save your life. I used to work as a trail guide, and this one time, I had to scout a trail that we didn't use much to make sure that it was safe for a guided hike that we had coming up. It was a simple process of checking for fallen trees, washed out paths, or anything else that might prove hazardous to the group. Probably one of the easiest things you get to do as a guide. I get to the deepest part of the trail, way out where it's just me and the trees. I'm kinda poking around looking for signs of trouble when, out of nowhere, 2 guys step out from behind the trees. They were rough looking, like they'd been out here a while with dirty clothes and scruffy faces. My stomach dropped as soon as I saw them because I could tell right away that their intentions weren't good. One had a knife in his hand, and the other was giving me this big, creepy smile. I remember trying my best to stay calm, but my heart was pounding so hard I could actually feel it. As they got close, the guy with the knife started yelling at me, telling me to hand over my stuff. He was vicious, waving that big knife around saying he'll cut me if I don't listen. I gave him my backpack, my water bottle, my Tamagotchi, and even what little cash he had on me. While that's happening, the other guy, the one with the smile, was acting very nice and saying things along the lines of, "Just do what we say, sweetheart, and you'll be fine." They tell me to turn around, and before I can say anything, they tie a blindfold over my eyes. It was an old rag that I remember smelled like sweat and dirt. After that, they tied my hands behind my back with more of that same kind of rag, probably old torn-up clothes, and then they yanked it tight so it hurt my wrists. I was trying to stay tough, but internally I was completely freaking out. I told them, Hey, you can't leave me like this. There's bears out here. If I'm tied up, I'm dead." I was hoping they'd have a heart, maybe loosen the ropes or something. But maybe that was the good cop having worked on me a little more than I'd like to admit. Because when they heard me asking for mercy, they just laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd heard all day. The mean one said, "Hey, that ain't our problem." And then I listened to the sound of the footsteps crunching away through the leaves before everything went quiet again. Once I was sure they were out of sight, I started wiggling my wrists and pulling hard against the rope. They were really tight and it hurt like heck, but I kept at it. And before long I was sweating, my arms were aching, and the bindings were starting to rub my skin raw. I tried twisting and tugging and even trying to pick at the knots with my fingers. Then after what felt like forever, but was probably a half hour, I finally got one hand loose. From there, I yanked the rag off completely and pulled the blindfold away. I was free, but I wasn't safe yet. I didn't stick around to look for my stuff those guys might have left behind. I just started running back down the trail as fast as my legs could carry me. The whole way, I was looking over my shoulder, half expecting those creeps to pop out again, but I kept moving till I finally saw the trailhead in the distance. When I got back to headquarters, my boss was there doing paperwork, and he just about jumped out of his chair as I burst in. I remember panting, trying to get the words out, but all I could manage at first was just call 911. He didn't ask questions. He just grabbed the phone and dialed as I sat down. Then after handing me the phone, I spilled the whole story to the dispatcher, the 2 guys, the knife, the blindfold, all of it. My boss stood there wide-eyed as I talked, listening to what I'd been through. He couldn't believe his ears, and he told me later that nothing that terrible has ever happened to any of his employees, past or present. Given the severity of the call, the cops showed up quickly, at which point I went over the story for a second time. They asked me to go into as much detail as possible in terms of describing the guys, as well as what they said and which direction I figured they might have gone. I did my best, but it was all a blur. They were unshaven, wearing dirty jackets. One was taller, the other one shorter, and I told them about the knife and that creepy good cop, bad cop routine too, and how it seemed almost rehearsed, like they'd done this before. The cops said that they'd send a team out to search the woods, but I didn't hold my breath. I knew those guys would probably be long gone. As the cops left, my boss told me to take the rest of the day off. He was a great guy like that, and he could see how rattled I was. And I sat in the break room waiting for my ride and trying to calm down, but every time I remembered how they'd laughed, this feeling of anger and dread would get all fat and heavy in my chest, and it'd only go away if I cried or yelled or hugged somebody. Those guys didn't care if I lived or died, and it makes my skin crawl to think about it today, but I still eternally am grateful to God for making sure that I made it back in one piece. Many years ago, I was out on a trail with my group, leading them through the woods like I've done 100 times before. It was a nice day, the sun was shining and the birds were chirping, and since we'd been hiking for a couple of hours, I figured it was time to take a break in a nearby stream. It's one that I regularly stopped at with my guys, and they'd top up their water bottles or splash their faces to keep cool, and then as usual, they put down their packs, pulled out their snacks, and then started chatting among themselves. I'm keeping an eye on them, making sure nobody wanders off or does anything dumb, like stepping on a loose rock when one of the guys, a guy with a big old backpack, asks if the water's safe to drink. It was a fair question. Nobody wants to chug something that's going to make them sick, so I tell them I'll check it out like I always do. And the routine was pretty simple. I walk upstream a little, maybe 50 yards or so, to make sure there's nothing funky in the water. Usually I'm looking for stuff like dead birds or small animals that might have fallen in and started rotting, because that kind of thing can leach nasty bacteria into the stream, and I ain't about to let my group get sick on my watch. In all my years guiding, I'd never found anything worse than a few leaves or some mud, and it's usually just a quick check to be on the safe side. So I leave the group to munch on their granola bars and head upstream. It's gurgling along all peacefully, and I'm just strolling, keeping my eyes peeled, and thinking about how I'll maybe crack a joke about how it's cleaner than city tap water. But then, I stop dead in my tracks. Right there in the middle of the stream, sitting in the shallow water, is a deer's head. Not just any deer's head. It was rotten, like really badly rotten too. And the thing's a total mess. The eyes are cloudy, there's flies buzzing around it, and the smell hits me like a punch to the nose. I've seen dead animals before, but nothing like that, because the cut where the head was chopped off was clean, way too clean for it to be some predatory animal. It was like someone took a sharp blade, made a hunting knife, and sliced clean through the thing's neck before they left it right in the water. My gut was telling me it wasn't an accident. It felt like someone put it there on purpose, like they wanted it to be found. I figured maybe it was a warning, though I didn't know who'd do something like that or why. I remember standing there for a second or two, just staring at it and trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. The water's flowing around it, carrying who knows what downstream to where my group's sitting, and I knew right then we had to move. The water wasn't safe, and from what I could tell, neither was being there in the first place. The only thing was, I knew I couldn't tell the whole truth either. Those folks were out there for nothing more than an afternoon hike. If I told them the truth, they might panic, and I didn't need a bunch of city people freaking out in the middle of the woods. I put on my calm face, the one I use when I need to keep things under control, and then I tell them that we need to head back to HQ. When they asked why, I kept it simple, and I calmly said that I thought there was a bear in the area, and it just so happened to be rutting season, and it's true that bears can get really dangerous during that time of year. It's a good enough story, and bears are scary, so nobody questioned it. I saw a couple of them looking a little nervous, but they trusted me to keep them safe, and that's exactly what I intended to do. I got them to grab their stuff, and then we started hiking back the way we came. The whole way back, I was keeping my eyes peeled, checking the trees and trail for anything else weird, but if someone was watching us, I sure as heck didn't see them. I kept quiet, but my mind was racing. Who'd do something like that? Was it some hunter messing around, someone trying to just scare us a little, or something worse? I didn't know, and I didn't like not knowing, but my job was to keep these people safe, so I focused on that. I kept the group moving at a steady pace, not too fast to make them worry, but quick enough to put some distance between us and that stream. I cracked a few jokes and pointed out some birds, anything to keep their minds off that bear. They were wary at first, but I guess they trusted me enough that by the time we were around halfway back, they were chatting and laughing again. When we got to HQ, I pulled the manager aside and told him that we need to cut that trip short. I didn't go into details about the deer head, not right away at least. I just say that we spotted signs of a bear and didn't want to take chances. He nodded, knowing that I'd never call it quits for no reason, and tell me that I did the right thing. We got the group's fees refunded, no questions asked, and while they were still a little bummed about the trip getting cut short, they were happy to get their money back. A few of them even thanked me for keeping them safe, saying they'll book another trip later when the bears aren't so active, and I just smiled and nodded, telling them to come back any time. But once they're gone, I sat down with a cup of coffee and told my boss what had really happened. We agreed it was probably nothing, just some idiot trying to spook us, but as I told him, it certainly didn't feel like nothing at the time. That deer's head still pops into my head sometimes like a message that I didn't fully understand yet. But the bottom line is I kept my group safe, and that's all that really counts. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to the podcast. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember...
Hi guys, it's me, Freya, and I want to finish my story from when I was like 6. I was walking in an enchanted forest, and the wind was blowing with fear, so I ran to my cabin. I called for my dad for 15 minutes, and there was no response, so I went to the bed and found a trail of blood leading to the bathtub. When I looked inside, there was my dad laying in there dead. When a note with a note saying, "Look behind my bed." So I ran to my bed, saw a man in the picture under my bed that looked like my dad, and he he had a baby in his arms and a woman right beside him. And I never had a mom, and on the back said, "Wow, I can't believe I had a baby." And next to it was a year that was 70 years ago. Comment down below what your favorite story was that Let's Read made.
Good job. Yippee!